There, Sean. Hello and most welcome to 1738. And we will begin with a brand new article with the enticing title, The Language Game of Revelation, by M.E. Locker of Manila and C. Sedmak of Salzburg. My colleague Kalle will talk a little bit about these authors. He's been looking into them.
I will mention Marcus Locker. He's at Ateneo de Manila University. He's a research professor for biblical theology. And then Clemens Sedmak. He has a German Wikipedia page. He's an Austrian theologian and philosopher. And we can see his specialty is, what is his specialty? What is his specialty really? Philosophy in general.
Sorry?
And theology.
What was his?
He's a theologian.
No, what was
he
his
discusses
specialty?
Aristotle. What is his specialty? I don't know. What is his specialty? Theology and philosophy, I think, the intersection between two fields. Okay. So, like here, one title: the human being is he or animal?
Political animal.
A zone political, that is a phrase from Aristotle. A political animal. So it's a very broad concept. So it's into politics, it seems so, and ethics.
Thank you for the presentation. Well, let's go into the text. And the language game of Revelation, interpreting the book of Revelation through Wittgenstein's philosophy of language. And we can make it a bit larger, maybe 200, if that's possible. Maybe a bit more. That's more than enough. Abstract. In recent studies, it has been possible to apply new approaches in philosophy, especially of linguistic philosophy, to the exegesis of the writings of the New Testament, utilizing Wittgenstein's model of language games. The following study of the meaning of the speech in the most difficult book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, reveals that the seer John does not speak of hidden events in the future, but intends to point to the addressee of his writing, to a new Christian existence already in the present world. For baptized believers, The symbols of his visions become signposts on the basis of which they would understand and act in the present world. The final motif of Revelation, God's gift of the New Jerusalem, is therefore not only a symbol of the fulfillment of the history of the world, but in the first place, a real description concerned with the present, perhaps even a prescription of conduct for the Christian communal life in a non-Christian world. This result is reached in consideration of A, the pragmatic dimension of the language act that is emphasized in the language game. And the rule-laden character of a game. In which winning is intended. In this way, the author and the content of Revelation is seen in a new, not previously considered way. In the end, John does not only say what will happen, but also what has to happen. That is what Christians are to do or not to do in the world in order to overcome it and to contribute to its transformation. Introduction. It does not take much research to become aware that exegetes do very much differ in their interpretation of the revelation. There's a disagreement not only about the meaning of Revelation's symbols and Old Testament allusions, but most of all, it's about the very genre of the book. An immense amount of work has gone especially into the literary study of revelation. For example, the Apocalypse group of the Society of Biblical Literature dedicated over 10 years of research and 2 entire issues of the periodical Semia to the question of the genre of revelation. In more recent times, a definite shift in interpretation has occurred in mainstream exegesis. It is a shift to an interpretation of revelation more focused on the historical situation of the addressees of the book. Recent historical studies have emphasized that Christian communities in Asia Minor were not massively threatened by persecution during the reign of Emperor Domitian. This called into question earlier interpretations of Revelation as a book of consolation in a time of persecution and hardship, or as preparation for imminent persecution. Renowned exegetes like Elizabeth Schüssler, Fiorenza, Adela Yarbrough Collins, and Leonard L. Thompson set out to study revelation anew. Fiorenza focuses on the historical, rhetorical situation of the book. Collins seeks to understand John's pre-understanding of the historical situation of his addressees. And Thompson interprets revelation as social discourse. Despite their valuable contribution to current biblical studies, the above-mentioned works were not able to advance to a consistent interpretation of revelation as a whole. Whereas justice certainly has been done to the historical situation of revelation, they pay too little attention to the specific nature and character of revelation's language. This article proposes that a genuine contribution to the interpretation of revelation can only be made by utilizing a method that adequately recognizes the philosophical character of revelation's language and at the same time points out its significance for its hearers. The method employed in this study is Ludwig Wittgenstein's language game model. Contrary to Augustine, who assumes that every word has a meaning that is correlated with the word, and at the same time, the object for which the word stands. Ludwig Wittgenstein believes that the philosophical concept of meaning has its place in a primitive idea of the way language is used and functions. The process of using words as language is called language game. In the necessary bridging of the existing gap between theological exegesis and philosophy, Wittgenstein's language game model is able to understand revelation's language in view of its meaning for the lives of its hearers. Knowing that God is speaking that he speaks to me is a part of an activity, or moreover, a particular form of life. Language games are part of a form of life and an activity. That is the very way we master our lives. The following analysis will show that John is actually introducing a new way of how language functions for its hearers. That is a new language game. Although he alludes to and uses elements of earlier language games of apocalyptic literature familiar to his readers, he forms those elements into a new language game, consequently with a new meaning. Revelation invites its addressees to participate in this new language game. Wittgenstein's language games. In his philosophical investigations, Ludwig Wittgenstein develops the concept of language games, offering a tool to analyzing language. He compares the function of words with the function of tools. Think of the tools in a toolbox. There's a hammer, pliers, a saw, a screwdriver, a rule, a glue pot, glue, nails, and screws. The functions of words are as diverse as the functions of these objects. From this observation of the diverseness of our linguistic units, Wittgenstein proceeds to invite us to view language as a system of language games. He uses this term to refer to the whole gamut of words used and activities surrounding the use of the words. This is what Wittgenstein said in the famous passage of the Blue Book, where he first introduced the concept of language games. I shall in the future again and again draw our attention to what I shall call language games. These are ways of using signs simpler than those in which we use the signs of our highly complicated everyday language. Language games are the forms of language with which a child begins to make use of words. Speaking is a way of acting. Uttering sentences is part of our way of life. And life is colorful and wide, deep and spontaneous. Basically, our whole culture can be seen as a loose network of language games, and our cultural community as a community of players who engage in a commonly understood and shared language games. There exists a vast variety of language games. And Wittgenstein invites the reader to stress this variety rather than a strict definition or an emphasis on borders between language games. According to Wittgenstein, language is a totality of language games. Language games are autonomous and not bound to one another in any strict sense. Language games equally exist side by side. Wittgenstein's language game model opposes a philosophy that later is called essentialism. Essentialism is the philosophical position that has the ambition to investigate the essence of things through what is questions. What is truth? What is reality? What is being, to name a few? For Wittgenstein, such questions are misleading because they ignore the multiplicity of the uses of language. There's an irreducible multiplicity of language games. Language cannot be reduced to one context, thus to one essence. Language games are connected to one another by way of loose family resemblances. Indeed, game and language are words that are used similarly. There's no single defining feature which all games have in common. Again, in Wittgenstein's own words, how many kinds of sentence are there? Say, assertion, question, and command. There are countless kinds. Countless different kinds of use of what we call symbols, words, sentences. And this multiplicity is not something fixed, given once for all, but new types of language, new language games, as we may say, come into existence. Others become obsolete and get forgotten. Here, the term language game is meant to bring into prominence the fact that the speaking of language is part of an activity or a form of life. Review the multiplicity of language games in the following examples and in others. Giving orders and obeying them. Describing the appearance of an object or giving its measurements. Constructing an object from description, for instance, a drawing. Reporting an event. Speculating about an event. forming and testing a hypothesis, presenting the results of an experiment in tables and diagrams, making up a story and reading it. Play acting, singing catches, guessing riddles, making a joke, telling it. Solving a problem in practical arithmetic. Translating from one language into another. Asking, thanking, cursing, greeting, praying. Language games are part of a way of life, part of an activity. Our way of life, that is the way we cope with our social lives. That is our way of master our interactions and actions. Wittgenstein does not give an exact definition of language games. Don't think, but look, is the advice he gives. Do not burden yourself by trying to give an exact definition. Just look at what is going on. Just look how we interact using language. Just look how we act by uttering sentences and words. You can move the text color when I read about 5 lines. I think that'd be enough. To see language games as part of our form of life allows Wittgenstein to translate the phenomenon language into multiple activities, which can be broken up into small, manageable parts that are also language games. Language games refer to praxis based on cultural and social interests. New interests in new activities necessitate the development of new language games. The most important aspects Wittgenstein underlined with reference to language are the following. Language games are distinguishable contexts of language use. There is an infinite number of different language games. Language games are governed by rules. Language games are not only governed by rules, there's also something beyond the rules, which can be called the point of the language game. Language games are connected with our way of living, with a form of life. In saying so, Wittgenstein is already crossing the bridge between language and culture. The concept of language games emerged gradually in Wittgenstein's later philosophy. It was nourished by two sources. Both roots are still present in the concept. First, the concept of language games is nourished by a theory of culture and the meaning and cultural significance of the term game. For instance, dancing rounds, tennis or soccer. Wittgenstein was struck by the idea of language games when watching a soccer game. Second, the language game model is grounded in the philosophy of mathematics, and specifically the concept of calculus, that is, mathematical operations based on strict rules. Wittgenstein's favorite example in this context is chess, which he frequently uses as an illustration of how language is rule-governed and of how we are able to make a distinction between changing the rules of an existing game versus playing a new game. E.g., we can play chess on a wooden or on an ivory board, but we cannot play chess without the queen. This would be a different game. These two dimensions, the idea of playing and games on the one hand, and the idea of calculus and rule-governed operations on the other, constitute the background of the language game model. There are rules and there's freedom. There's a set of guidelines and there's a point. It's important to see that the two sources Wittgenstein uses prevent his concept of language from being either too narrow or mechanical, or too wide and too diffuse. Wittgenstein's concept of language helps us to see culture as a network of rules and helps us to see language as a part of an overall cultural context. In this sense, it is easy to base a theory of culture on Wittgenstein's language game model. Language and culture follow the same dynamics of rules, the possibility to deviate from rules, and the conditions of success for both linguistic and extra-linguistic actions. The success of actions and the meaningfulness of linguistic units depend on the fulfillment of certain non-linguistic presupposition. That is the context of language. For example, whether tears are tears of joy or tears of grief, despair or fatigue, depends on the context. We cannot make sense of isolated linguistic units. We have to consider the context. And the context consists of linguistic and extra-linguistic factors. The primary context of language is the praxis of its use. The common praxis of all language is the acquired behavior of its users, which is their culture. Thereupon, Wittgenstein understands language games as forms of life. While forms of life can be different, humans are conjoined. By way of common behavior, excellently put. This common behavior is the system of reference or a worldview. Through which language is interpreted. All persons share in this conditio humana. Thus, the existing multiplicity of language games has a common basis, namely human behavior. Understanding human behavior is possible because of the common behavior of humankind. and B, challenging because of the hidden contexts. Rules are partially explicit and partially implicit. The rules of language are studied through its grammar. For Wittgenstein, grammar denotes both the constitutive rules of language and the philosophical investigation or tabulation of these rules. Consequently, Wittgenstein calls his investigations into language grammatical investigations. Grammatical investigations are the genuine task of philosophy. Grammatical investigations are not merely investigations into the structure of linguistic constructions. Wittgenstein distinguishes between the surface grammar and the depth grammar of words. It's only the surface grammar that can be grasped by looking at the visible structure and the explicit rules. The surface grammar is the sentence structure. The surface grammar of the sentence, I talk to my friend, is the same as the surface grammar of the sentence, I talk to God. But the depth grammar, the hidden and implicit rules, the philosophical consequences and presuppositions the conditions of success and the necessary contextual prerequisites are entirely different. If you wish, they follow a different logic. While surface grammar of a word is its visible form, its depth grammatical dimension can only be understood by way of analysis. Again, we are talking of a philosophical and not of a linguistic analysis. Wittgenstein distinguishes grammatical investigations from empirical investigations. And with that most important phrase, we will make a stop because we got loads of material already here. So we take a note of where we are. The last words into the way words are used. Do take a note of that. Into the way words are used. I made some notes while reading. Didn't have time to look at it beforehand. Page 244, go there, Kalle, please. Hmm. 20 lines down. According to Wittgenstein, language is a totality of language games. Language games are autonomous and not bound to one another in any strict sense. This goes at the wind of what everybody's saying. Everyone is seeing language as units, absolute units, even characterized by being language. Not so, according to Wittgenstein. Language games exist side by side, unconnected. And it flies in the wind of essentialism. We already know what essentialism is. Further down, 3 lines before the quote, we find, indeed, game and language are words that are used similarly. So it's indeed a game. Page 245, 20 different suggestions, and there are millions more of what language can be. Giving order, you can go to the next page, I think it is. We will find that suggestions. This is just a random list, but here you see, far from the common idea that language is only communication and possibly description, it has millions of different language games, unconnected to each other. Austin, that we treated before, the language philosopher, he could accept some of these, but he did not like language as it was used, for instance, in a wedding, nor in a court of justice, because those didn't refer to anything. They were an act in themselves. I hereby wed. That's the doing. Doesn't refer to anything in the world. Or listen to this. I sentence you. It does something, but it doesn't refer to anything in the slightest. Actually, despite what people think, language seldom refers. It does refer, but it's not the most common use of language. And here we have good giving orders, doesn't refer to anything. Speculating by an event. What on earth is that, even in analytical philosophy? I remember that Austin really hated theatre. He said it was parasitic and should be obliterated. The way of using language in theatre was impossible to put into his philosophy. So there are different ways of doing. And oddly enough, we can't even use the word doing because it's also part of a separate language game. But in order to have a first start, doing would work, that these are acts. But don't think that it's an accurate description, because it can't be. There is no language game outside that can refer to these different tidbits. It's a helping tool to getting rid of the misunderstanding. Austin, it's so good that we took him up. He was brought to the view by Derrida. Page 246. The third one, the language games are governed by rules. This is important to understand. They are not expressible rules. They are exactly like the rules in football. You can learn the rules of football through a piece of paper. It's probably not more than, let's see, 20 pages, something like that. But when you start playing, you will learn that there are many, many more rules coming from the game, where you have to participate to understand them. And you can't even express them by an external rule-making language that wouldn't be connected to the game. I hope you see what I'm getting to here. Norman Malcolm further down noted that language games came from watching a soccer game. Football game, I would say, a more correct way of expressing it. The mathematical language game is based on the concept of calculus. That is also a sort of doing that doesn't have external rules, as proven by Gödel. to his own demise. The last sentence, or the penultimate sentence, I think it is. No, the last one. Wittgenstein's concept of language helps us to see culture as a network of rules, helps us to see language as a part of an overall cultural context. "20 lines down there, we will also understand why it's shared, which is important to be convinced. While forms of life can be different, humans are conjoined by way of common behavior. Think of the football game. The team members are participating. They don't need written rules or expressed rules. They play together, therefore they share. And all of a sudden, an outside word doesn't even make sense. It's a false construction that could never, ever show why something is shared. This common worldview," it continues a bit further down. If you go to "all persons share in this conditio humana." We share because we are human. We don't share everything. If you go to a culture that is different enough, less will be shared. Do you see how Wittgenstein explains things that no one can explain? And when it only ends in paradoxes, where you have sign and signify, that doesn't make any sense at all and doesn't work. And when the philosophers don't even make sense to themselves, that's pretty bad, like Gödel. There's no deeper reality than the doing. And if you have an existence reality, you are not in reality. You are sort of locked in a fantasy you won't even yourself understand. Go to further down. The bottom almost. The surface grammar of the sentence "I talk to my friend." Do note it's in the ongoing verbal in its presence. I'll clarify. Is the same as the surface grammar of the sentence "I talk to God." But the depth grammar, the hidden and implicit rules, are enormously different. And I don't think anyone would have this objection other than Wittgenstein and these two authors. Great theologians compare "I talk to my friend," and then you can say there is no friend there, therefore there is no God, and so forth. You see how that picture-driven thinking destroys understanding, and why theology obliterates God if this is not taken care of. And the authors call it, can give it a different name, but it has a depth grammar, the hidden and implicit rules, the philosophical consequences and presuppositions, and more importantly, the conditions of success and the necessary contextual prerequisites are entirely different. It brings to remembrance an Indian friend said to me that Christians from the West prayed as they were talking to a friend. And he said, I bet you that the prayers are not working, they don't reach, and they don't. The reason is this mistaken picture that we are all under, so to speak. And as I said in the previous lecture, unavoidable. You don't make a huge mistake if you fall for the picture, not at all. Our not falling for the picture would be impossible, I would say. It's like saying that the earth doesn't exist. It is definitely part of our perception. The surface grammar of the word is its visible form. Its depth grammatical dimension can only be understood by way of analysis or doing. That was long enough from my side. Kalle, please come by.
Let's go to page 244. Let me see. No, it wasn't 244. Here. I was thinking about the word wits. We have a similar word in Swedish, but with a simple so I think it's like in Swedish ambiguous. Like a joke.
Witz in German has the same meaning as witz in Swedish.
Yes, wit. Okay, it corresponds to the English wit, joke, etc., etc. So if you go return to the text, language games are not only governed by rules. There is also something beyond the rules, which can be called the point, which of the language game. As I don't think the point, the English word point is the best translation of wits. Wit is something humorous, a joke. Like if you have, I have worked with different phrases in New Testament. So scholars don't know, is Apostle Paul affirming here something, like is he serious or is ironious? Ironic. Where is the difference between being serious, that he's affirming something, or is he only being ironical? So that is, I think. So how do you now today, 2000 years later, know if Paul was serious or he was joking? Irony cuts borders. And and a dictionary you cannot really put convey irony. And also another phrase related to this was here under, it was the last paragraph on the, what is the next page? No, it was the next page here. The different kinds of sentences. Let me see. No, I think yes, about possibilities was also important. So, So I agree with. I think the word which is very important. absolutely irony and rules. Of course, you need rules, but you need also. But the rules, I don't say. So it's like in this. Rules are like the universal grammar. You have them, but rules follow always after, are always secondary to the main point. Grammar can change. Like in quantum physics.
The grammar is, I would say, grammar is must change, otherwise it wouldn't be grammar. Think about the football game. It's constantly changing in the game.
Absolutely, and
sort of what makes them to be rules.
Yes, absolutely, and we should think in this context, the Monty Python soccer game between the Germans and the Greeks.
Come again, you broke up there.
Speaking of soccer games, we can think of a soccer game, of the Monty Python soccer game between the Greeks and the Germans.
The philosophers.
So there you see, okay, they have rules, but I think the width there is something higher.
Oh yeah.
That we get
definitely. It's variable, and it's only when you do the things, for instance, maybe you can compare in football, making witzes could be pretending to kick the ball. And that could be interpreted as, from a point of view, as irony. But it is still working. It's a very important part of the game, the so-called irony, and it's an act. You wouldn't be able to play football with those things going on. And I don't think they seriously make a difference between true acts and non-acts. It all comes together in the soccer game.
Yes, and speaking of soccer game, I recommend to all our viewers after this recording watch the Monty Python soccer game again.
Oh, most
and think
definitely.
About the bits and long games.
Definitely.
Well, perhaps we should end there.
Yeah, it was a very good introduction to the language games. I imagine there will be a repetition, but this sort of thing won't change by a sudden. It needs repetition to sort of make its point. And some of the things here made things clearer for me as well. So it's of very good use. Thank you, Kalle, for bringing this text in and for your comments. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Have a very pleasant day, afternoon, evening, or wherever you are. I stop the recording here. Bye-bye.